Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that today's event takes place on the occupied ancestral lands of the Ho-Chunk and Menominee people who have stewarded this land since time immemorial. And we've often forgotten or chosen to forget the stories of this place. So I hope that today's talk can be one small step toward rectifying that wrong. The land holds stories. In every place you have ever been, along every river and on every hillside, countless people have lived, loved, fought, and negotiated their survivance, which is a word that means persistence and survival and living and thriving in a space. While we remember some of those stories, many others have been lost. Stories like the one I'll share tonight, of an illiterate but multilingual woman of mixed French and Ho-Chunk lineage who played a pivotal role as a go-between for the white settler population of Stevens Point and what is today the Wittenberg Ho-Chunk community are not easy to find. But as an historian who wants to exist in a way that respects the land where I live and the people who have come before me, I see it as my responsibility to find a few of the stories and share them. For a long time, stories of Stevens Point and Portage County have focused on lumberjacks and Polish potato farmers, rivermen and university chancellors, entrepreneurs, and of course, brewers. Our most detailed stories often center men because the archive is fundamentally biased. Sorry to the archivists. It's made up of documents produced for and by the powerful, and often the powerful are men. And it speaks to their interests and their goals, which are everything from land to money to you name it. But often it's not about women, it's not about children, it's not about the marginalized. So women like Julia are mentioned only in passing, the unseen labor that keeps things going and the glue that holds the world together. One visual reminder of this exclusion from the record will be visible tonight. There are photographs of many of the men Julia knew, but none of her, at least none that I've found. Even so, Julia's story is important because as we peer through the cracks in the archive, her presence gives insight to historical moments that are often distilled down to lists of dates, forts, treaties, and battles. So, Julia. When Julia Grignon Mayrond arrived in Stevens Point in the late summer of 1875, she had already lived 1,000 lifetimes. In her 63 years, she had survived wars, land grabs, pandemics, forced removals, settler panics, and cultural genocide, half a century of traumatic upheaval. She was born in 1812 near the portage of the Fox and Wisconsin rivers to a Creole, or mixed race, woman named Monteese. That's the butchered way we say it in English, or Thérèse Lecuyer, the daughter of the influential Decora family and granddaughter of Glory of the Morning, who is often described as the last female chief of the Ho-Chunk. Thérèse was the widow of wealthy French fur trader Jean Lecuyer, who had controlled the portage between the Fox and the Wisconsin. Julia's father, my first picture of somebody who's not Julia. Julia's father was a French Odawa fur trader named Augustin Grignon, whose extensive kin and trade network spanned the state and the entire Great Lakes area. Records indicate that she may also have had Meskwaki ancestry. When Julia was born, her mixed-race, multilingual family was wealthy, well-connected, and well-positioned to serve as interpreters and interlocutors, cultural brokers who bridged the gap between European settlers, French fur trade families like the Vos and Junos, and indigenous tribes like the Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Meskwaki, and Potawatomi. Julia spent her early years with her mother and younger brother Antoine, surrounded by Ho-Chunk elders, including the aging Glory of the Morning. They followed the seasons, planting corn and living in villages near the portage. Her childhood was spent among the wild rice marshes and wetlands around the portage and in the bluffs of the Baraboo with her mother's people. In the doorways of, I'm gonna butcher this word again, Chapatake, the like structures that we have kind of pejoratively called wigwams as white people. She was in those doorways listening to the sayings of the old men who reminded her of the responsibility of hospitality that she bore. They said, "If one enters your lodge, share your food with him. Even the last kernel of corn should be divided with him. And the food given is love for a fellow man." They reminded her that the earth, the day, and the trees are witnesses of your deeds. Settler greed would soon change her life forever. Almost as soon as the War of 1812 ended, lead miners, the Badgers that we are so proud of, began illegally entering the Ho-Chunk heartland of the driftless area, squatting on land that was not their own, ravaging the land and its people. Despite Ho-Chunk resistance, the United States produced a series of treaties that undermined Ho-Chunk sovereignty and autonomy. In 1827, a leader named Redbird fought back against the settler intrusion in what is now called the Winnebago War. In response, the United States demanded land cessions from the Ho-Chunk, and the Army began building a fort at the portage of the Fox and the Wisconsin, a short walk from Julia's childhood home. A company of men, led by David Twiggs, cut down tamarack trees to build rugged log houses while the larger fort was being built. Without wives accompanying them, many of the newly arrived Americans sought out sexual companionship among the mixed French Indian women living nearby. Julia's family had a generations-long history of intermarriage and cohabitation with interlopers, which had served to guarantee survival and flourishing of family fortunes. Whether accomplished through negotiation or coercion, or some complicated intersection of both, at 16 years old, the fort's commander, David Twiggs, impregnated Julia. His reputation for violence and anger toward his troops is a matter of written record, so one can only imagine how he might have treated the Ho-Chunk women and men who lived near the fort. When Julia gave birth to her only child at 17 years old, she named him David Twiggs, after his father. Several other officers at Fort Winnebago, including later Confederate President Jefferson Davis, also fathered children by Native women. And that's a story we don't talk about very often. So when the fort was finished and the wives of those men arrived, however, it was as though these relationships had never happened. Later writers called these morganatic marriages, a term that means a marriage where a lower ranked spouse has no claim to the possessions or title of a spouse of higher rank. This is a coy euphemism to describe rape, not marriage at all, but exploitation. These women and their experiences were collectively forgotten, as evidenced by the silence in Juliet Kinsey's famous book, Wabun, which describes Major Twiggs and his wife at great length, but ignores Julia and the other young girls who shared Julia's experience. Julia was unable to care for her young child, so her childless half-brother Jacques took over the care and raising of David, and Julia moved with her mother to Prairie du Chien. And I promise we'll get to Stephen's point, but she lived a very long and very interesting life. So at Prairie du Chien, which was a city at the confluence of the Wisconsin and Mississippi rivers, it was a center for Creole culture and the fur trade. In the early 1830s, just as settlers were invading their homelands and the government was extorting treaty after treaty from them, the Ho-Chunk were decimated by smallpox, with some reports that 1/4 of the population in Wisconsin perished. It was during these years that Julia and her mother gained a reputation for enacting the words of the elders. Julia gave her last loaf of bread to hungry Ho-Chunks who saw her home as their home, and even sold her own clothes to relieve them. In her own words, she said, "So far as in my power, I have rendered them every service." While Julia and her mother were doing the unglamorous but necessary work of community care and public mothering, Julia's brother and half-brothers were not strangers in the halls of power. They served as interpreters in cities from Madison to Washington, D.C. to New York City. While Julia did not go on these trips, she would have been part of conversations with her brother, Antoine, who always, quote, endeavored to impress upon the Ho-Chunk the importance of being friends to the government of the United States. Antoine was in Washington. in 1837, when the federal government took the final swath of Ho-Chunk ancestral territory from west central Wisconsin to northwestern Illinois by forcing the Ho-Chunk negotiators visiting Washington to sign a treaty document. Based on Ho-Chunk cultural norms, the men in Washington were negotiators who had no standing to sign the paper, but the Indian Affairs commissioners refused to allow their return to Wisconsin to explain the terms of the agreement and receive consent from the tribe. Trapped in the urban hellhole of Washington, D.C., they were forced to sign a fraudulent treaty that they thought gave them 4 years to move from their lands. However, settlers wanted the rich lead country of the driftless area, as well as the lush, arable land of the Wisconsin River Valley, and the government, both territorial and federal, was happy to enforce its hegemony on the landscape. Beginning just 8 months after the treaty was signed, in 1838, soldiers tracked down and tried to force Ho-Chunk to the so-called neutral ground, which you can see there on the map in Iowa. And that was just across the river from Prairie du Chien. In a persistent act of resistance, many Ho-Chunk people returned surreptitiously, walking back to their old homes. Around this time, Julia married a French Menominee man named John Mayrond, son of a French voyageur who worked as a farmer on the Iowa reservation. It is unclear if she lived in Iowa with him, or if she maintained a home in Prairie du Chien, but this relationship would shape the next several years of her life. In 1848, Julia's life took another drastic turn when the United States decided to move the Ho-Chunk yet further from their homeland. The government rounded up hundreds of Ho-Chunk people, herding them onto steamboats and taking them up the Mississippi to a desolate piece of land called Long Prairie, Minnesota. And you can see that way up north. All along the way, Ho-Chunk people tried to negotiate lands closer to home. Antoine and Julia were there. Julia would have heard the screams as people jumped overboard, desperate to stay in their homes. But as a friend of the government, she might have tried to reassure them that this distant land could be a new home. Many of her friends and kin moved to Long Prairie, families who had lived in scattered villages, and you can see with the present-day Ho-Chunk lands just what we mean by scattered. Like, they lived everywhere in Wisconsin. They live everywhere in Wisconsin. So they lived near Green Lake and Lake Koshkonong, alongside family from the Lemonware River and the Four Lakes area, or Des Jope, what we call Madison today. Although many Ho-Chunk stayed in Long Prairie at the behest of the government agent, some of them resisted. Many Ho-Chunk people evaded capture, refusing to accept the authority of the United States. They lived as fugitives in the relative safety of coulees on the Wisconsin, Mississippi, and Black Rivers, in the swamps of the upper Wisconsin, among rocky bluffs far from white encroachment, or in the still deep woods. One French Indian fur trader began to encourage the Ho-Chunk to gain citizenship and purchase land to become legal residents in Wisconsin. Yellow Thunder, because I am not good at pronouncing this name either, Yellow Thunder was the first to experiment with this means of survival. He went to the land office in Mineral Point and purchased a 40-acre plot along Dell Creek in Sauk County. His choice was perceptive. Long Prairie was not at all like Wisconsin. It was too far north, too cold, too overgrown with trees, and too sandy for crops. The Ho-Chunk who stayed there struggled to reestablish the patterns of the yearly round. In Wisconsin, this had meant semi-nomadic lifeways that included trapping fur-bearing animals in winter, tapping maples as the snow melted, planting corn, squash, beans, and potatoes in spring, berrying in summer, harvesting crops in fall, and hunting deer as the weather turned frigid. In Minnesota, the government agent wanted them to stay in one place, as this was considered a mark of white civilization. In Long Prairie, Julia's only brother, Antoine, died, and his family moved in with her. When the Ho-Chunk negotiated for a new reservation near Mankato, Minnesota in 1853, she went too. And that's just an image of the Indian Agency house near Mankato. There, the Winnebago Reservation was on prime farmland, land that settlers in southern Minnesota wanted. Julia's husband, John, who had spent years as a clerk for fur traders, served as clerk of elections, much to the vitriol of local white settlers. In 1857, after the Santee Uprising in Iowa, Julia's son David was the only person willing to traverse the distance from St. Paul, Minnesota to Sioux City, Iowa with the mail. He also served as a deputy constable. While her husband and son both performed administrative and law enforcement duties, there is no mention of Julia. The record simply does not show what she was doing. When the Civil War erupted, many of Julia's family and friends went off to battle. David was mustered into the Union Army in May of 1861, 1 month after the attack on Fort Sumter. He spoke of his determination to find and kill his father, now a Confederate general. Surely Julia was relieved when David was discharged due to disability 3 months later. Not long after, John went away to war, never to return. Although the battles, and we're back to this map, although the battles were far off, the war's impact on Indian country was profound. Already negligent at best, the United States government stopped fulfilling its treaty commitments altogether. In 1862, the Ho-Chunk's neighbors, the Dakota, revolted against these injustices perpetrated by the United States and its henchmen. It was said that Julia, by this time 50 years old, traveled through the woods at night to warn the white settlers of the approaching outbreak. After the mass execution of 38 Dakota men and war's end, settlers forced the Dakota and the Ho-Chunk to a distant reservation in Crow Creek, South Dakota. Despite Julia's faithful work for peace, she was not rewarded. She did not go on the long road to dusty Crow Creek, and she was not there when the Ho-Chunk escaped down the Missouri River in dugout cottonwood canoes to their friends in Nebraska, the Omaha. Julia and David instead moved to the shores of the Mississippi near Fort Snelling. But when David joined the Army again in 1863, Julia had had enough of Minnesota. Perhaps she was fed up with the government's continued failure to uphold its treaties, or maybe she was homesick for the wide waters of the Wisconsin River and the bluffs of her home, where many of her relatives lived still following the seasonal round. Whatever the case, by 1870, her family members had scattered to the four winds. Her half-brother, Alex Payer, was a policeman on the Winnebago Reservation in Nebraska, while her Lekuye half-brothers had found ways to stay in southern Minnesota. David was working on a steamboat that plied the Chippewa River, and she was back home in Sauk County. There she worked as a servant in the homes of James Steele and his wife, a centenarian who lived just upriver from Yellow Thunder's 40-acre homestead, where large gatherings of Ho-Chunk people occurred regularly. Although many of the people she had grown up with were gone, she was still part of a network of people of mixed French and indigenous heritage that crisscrossed the state, and she was still surrounded by kinfolk, but now she was an elder. Within 2 years, her employers had passed away, and while she continued to work outside of her home, she remained near her people. She was in Portage when the federal government, at the urging of local landowners, came down like a wolf on the fold to capture a group of Ho-Chunk people celebrating a winter feast near Portage. The troops, led by Captain C.A. Hunt, loaded the Ho-Chunk onto unheated boxcars headed for the prairies of Nebraska, but not before Big Hawk, the Ho-Chunk leader, sent runners alerting local allies to their plight. Big Hawk's most vocal ally was named Henry W. Lee. This is him much, much later in life. He was an English immigrant and lawyer who had been hired by many members of the tribe to advocate for the Ho-Chunk to remain in Wisconsin in the months before removal. He could not speak Ho-Chunk, so he hired a Frenchman named John Delarond to interpret. Delarond was married to one of Julia's cousins and had a complicated history as a cultural broker who often privileged governmental and settler goals over those of the broader Ho-Chunk community. At the same time, it was his efforts that had helped Yellow Thunder claim a homestead 25 years before. Midway through 1873, Delarond quit working for Lee and began working for Hunt, the government enforcer. Lee then hired 2 new interpreters, one, a blind man named John Fisher, and the other, Julia. And I don't have a picture of Julia now either. During the winter of 1873, more and more Ho-Chunk were forcibly taken to Nebraska, and hundreds died there from exposure and disease. Big Hawk sent letters to Lee describing their situation and affirming their willingness to become civilized, I'm quoting here, take farms and become citizens if the government would be willing to, quote, give us back our homes in Wisconsin. By the summer of 1874, traveling overland, streams of Ho-Chunk people clad in brightly colored blankets returned to Wisconsin, determined never to leave again. Thanks to the advocacy of Lee, settlers in the town of Reedsburg, and Jacob Spaulding in Black River Falls, white settlers no longer had any political will to remove the Ho-Chunk. Following Yellow Thunder's blueprint, many of them had tapped into a Reconstruction-era idea of achieving citizenship through land ownership, and they used citizens' clothing when it benefited them. They bought up and rented small plots of land across southern Wisconsin, but they needed a more permanent solution. Lee visited Washington in 1875, and shortly thereafter, the Homestead Act was expanded to include Indian people. That summer, Lee, Big Hawk, and Julia traveled north from Portage into the mostly unsettled area east and northeast of Wausau. And this is a really zoomed in image of Pike Lake, which is up the Plover River between here and Hatley, Wisconsin, if you're familiar with the geography of our area. So, after 3 days of tramping through the woods, Big Hawk chose the eastern shore of Pike Lake for his homestead. This spot was an abundant fishery at the farthest navigable point on the Plover River, about 20 miles from the bustling lumber town of Stevens Point, and not far from the upper reaches of the Wolf River system. To maintain proximity to Big Hawk, who he hoped would be a lucrative income stream, Lee brought his large family to Stevens Point, setting up his attorney's office downtown and living on Prentice Street. As Yellow Thunder and Blue Wing had done in the southern part of the state, Big Hawk's initial land claim, along with those of two close relatives, one of whom was Julia's cousin, Spoon, gave large groups of Ho-Chunk a place of sojourn at a time when white settlers were in an uproar. In October of 1875, hundreds of Ho-Chunk people came to Stevens Point. That month in Stevens Point, the biggest news was the lynching of the Courtwright brothers and the murder of Sheriff Baker, and the Ho-Chunk presence didn't even register. It was only newspapers from farther away that tell us that the Ho-Chunk were driven out of the city, up to Big Hawk's 40 acres on Pike Lake. The following winter was long and cold, and because they had been unable to plant corn for many seasons, the Ho-Chunk were destitute. With Julia's help, Lee arranged to purchase wagon loads of provisions from area grocers. He also convinced the U.S. Congressman for Stevens Point, G.W. Cate, to petition Congress to help the Ho-Chunk. When Cate received pushback from his constituents, he withdrew his public support. For the rest of his tenure, he supported Lee's claims to Ho-Chunk money, but he did not support Ho-Chunk people themselves. So, this is my little map. So, Stevens Point was a bustling crossroads for Menominee, Ho-Chunk, Potawatomi, and Ojibwe groups who chose to live off-reservation, free from the oppressive reach of the Indian agents. Its position on the Wisconsin Central Railroad also provided easy access to the wider world, making visits to Madison to visit the governor easier, as well as traveling long distance to see relatives in the Meskwaki settlement of Tama, Iowa, or the Winnebago Reservation in Nebraska. And here you can see that surrounding Stevens Point, there are so many different communities at this time period. There's, and I've got the list here so make sure I don't forget any. On the west side of town, Mill Creek meanders off toward the Ho-Chunk communities on Hemlock Creek and the Potawatomi-led community at Skunk Hill, now Powers Bluff, while the Little and Big O Plain rivers flow out toward the Indian Farm near Roselleville, where a vibrant community maintained dance rings and traditional lifeways. The Plover Portage, down here, between the Wisconsin River and the Tomorrow River, brought Potawatomi people living near Marion into easily traveling distance. And for the Ho-Chunk and Potawatomi people living at Pike Lake, Stevens Point was a market town. But not only that, for many, it was where they were buried, on the land where the university now sits. The Ho-Chunk sold foraged ginseng root, slippery elm bark, and many other medicinal plants to Stevens Point buyers. Although they do not appear in old pictures of downtown Stevens Point, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The Ho-Chunk were fixtures of the greater Stevens Point area. Every summer, they picked blueberries, then blackberries, then cranberries, and in the winter, they tramped skunks, muskrats, and otters. Julia rendered her services to the Ho-Chunk however she could. This included welcoming them into the office and home space of her employer, to the chagrin of Lee's wife and his landlord. Although Julia lived with the Chandreau family in the 4th Ward, most of her waking hours were spent in the business district. Her living situation showed her deep connection to kin networks across Wisconsin, since the Chandreaus were a mixed-race fur trade family. Louisa, the matriarch, was related to Jean-Baptiste Dubé, a man Julia had known since her childhood in Portage and a longtime resident of the Stevens Point area. But But Julia's work went beyond simple trade and market interpretation. Lee worked as a lawyer, helping the Ho-Chunk make land claims throughout Marathon and Shawano counties. He also started newspapers that reflected his political leanings and gave him a platform for his diatribes against the Indian ring, which he said was fleecing the Ho-Chunk of their rightful money. He used his press to publish petitions for Congress and histories of the Ho-Chunk people, efforts that Julia surely facilitated in her role as intermediary. When the United States government sent a new agent to take account of the Ho-Chunk before an annual payment of promised funds in 1881, called an annuity payment, the 69-year-old Julia hiked all over the countryside with the agent, looking for people who had not been counted. While this was going on, Lee was loudly complaining that he had never been paid for his services to the Ho-Chunk and for the things he had done for Julia. Many Ho-Chunk rightfully saw annuity payments as a ploy to limit their autonomy and freedom and refused to be enumerated. Characteristically, Lee framed this refusal as support for him, but this seems far-fetched. Until the Indian agent threatened the cancellation of their homestead claims, the Pike Lake Ho-Chunk refused enumeration, and their annuities went unpaid for 5 years. Another aspect of Julia's work was with the court system. As far back as 1832, she had leaned on the law to fulfill her own ends when she filed for divorce from her first legal husband, a well-connected Meskwaki man in Prairie du Chien. Although she never applied for citizenship in Minnesota in 1871 when her son and half-siblings did, she still likely helped several Ho-Chunk men apply at the courthouse in Portage County 5 years later. Though they were ultimately unsuccessful, the attempt itself shows that by this time, Ho-Chunk people saw citizenship as a means to achieve the autonomy and sovereignty they desired. Julia was also on hand for land disputes as both locals and federal agents tried to encroach upon and steal Ho-Chunk homesteads. Although some settlers overtly stole things like valuable logs from Ho-Chunk property, still others devised legal but unethical schemes to contest Ho-Chunk claims in a bid to dispossess their neighbors. While some were successful, Julia and Lee stopped at least 2 attempts to contest homestead claims, one by a Scandinavian immigrant named S.O. Jasted, and the other by a Polish immigrant named Baranowski. Her work with the court system ran the gamut from real estate law to civil and criminal proceedings. Police court records from 1881 show that she interpreted for a man who was, quote, drunk and intoxicated on the streets of the city of Stevens Point and received 75 cents in payment for her work. In 1885, when a Ho-Chunk man named John Bear was found dead on the Jordan Road, today's Highway 66 between Jordan and Polonia, this is just a general map. You can see going out that way would be the Jordan Road. So, Julia was the interpreter at that inquest. There, it was decided that Peter Iden, a Prussian immigrant, had unlawfully sold liquor to John, which in the bitter cold of a December night led to his death from exposure on the marsh. Perhaps one of the most tragic cases recorded in Stevens Point occurred 138 years ago, in February of 1886. It was 1 week after Big Hawk and his band had finally signed the annuity rolls, and just as they were set to receive their payment. 2 Ho-Chunk women, one a teenager, the other middle-aged, were sexually assaulted after stopping for a warm drink at a house of ill repute just outside of Stevens Point, near where Park Ridge is today. The assault led to the girl's death, but there was no mention of it in the newspapers and no sign of justice forthcoming. Although the records of the case are sketchy, based on newspaper articles and end-of-year expense reports, it appears that Julia took on a more prominent role in this case. Unlike previous cases in Stevens Point, she was not listed as an interpreter, but as a witness. It seems likely that she was considered too close to the victims to be impartial. An old friend and neighbor of hers named John St. Cyr, a French Ho-Chunk man whose life had followed a similar trajectory to her own, traveled from Black River Falls to translate for the case. Michael Rousseau, the part Ojibwe sheriff of Portage County, had been unable to assist since he spoke only Menominee and Ojibwe, not Ho-Chunk. Both the leaders of the Black River Falls branch of the tribe and members of the Stevens Point public resisted bringing the case to trial. But the Pike Lake Band paid the district attorney and his assistant $2,000 to press for justice. Unfortunately, the 2 men accused, brothel owner Charles Crockett and bartender Charles Hoffel, were part of a network of their own, one of organized crime with tendrils all across the Pinery. Furthermore, scuttlebutt around town had it that local elites had been at the brothel that day. Regardless of what the Ho-Chunk survivor, her 9 friends and relatives, or Julia had to say, the decision was made before the court ever convened. Judge Kingsbury did not even see fit to try the accused. In previous cases of sexual assault against Indigenous women that had gone to trial and ended with conviction, the perpetrators had been recent immigrants, poor themselves, without connections. Not here. This time, all the gears of the system ground to a halt to protect their own. At the year's end county supervisors meeting, the official meeting minutes declared the case a, quote, reckless waste of public funds, and Portage County swept it under the rug. After this, Julia fades from the public record, and we do not hear of her interpreting again. I just can't remember what's next. Nope, not yet. During her time in Stevens Point, Julia received sustained public acclaim for the first time in her life. Versions of her story appeared in statewide newspapers, in an 1881 history of northern Wisconsin, and in a Portage County history book published in 1919. Although she had been well known among her kin and the Creole communities in Prairie du Chien, Portage, and Green Bay before the removals, she had been systematically ignored by the dominant white culture. But now, in her later years, she was described as being of much more than ordinary intelligence, a deserving woman, and a famous French Winnebago resident. This may have been a function of her age, or perhaps the fact that she was living in a predominantly white space, but still enacting the heritage of her ancestors, rendering every service she could for her people. Although she continued to receive her annuity payment from the government, there is no record of Julia asking the Ho-Chunk at Pike Lake for help, even when outsiders describe her as living in abject poverty. Rather, she took advantage of institutions of Stevens Point, where she was listed, almost as an afterthought, inside the front cover of a treasurer's ledger as a non-resident pauper from about 1884 until her death. After the calamity of the 1886 judgment, the Ho-Chunk seemed less and less reliant on Lee and more openly skeptical of his motivations. The records indicate that multilingual and cross-culturally proficient members of their own community, like Amos Bearhart and George Goodvillage, were interpreting, writing letters, and speaking to men in positions of power. As a woman of both Ho-Chunk and French descent, Julia spent her life navigating cultural, racial, and linguistic divides. Unfortunately, Julia's story in the archive is a fragmented one. She did not read or write, so her voice is largely inaccessible to a text-based historian. And we must read between the lines of the documents and events of her life. Nevertheless, her story is an important one, not least because it opens a window into a world of other stories and other questions. Throughout Julia Grignon Mayrond's lifetime of service to the Ho-Chunk, her efforts prioritized Ho-Chunk stability and survivance over the predation and treachery of the settler colonial empire. She fulfilled the words she had been taught, to live as though the earth, the day, and the trees were her witnesses, whether it was stately elms at the Portage, basswood and ash on the floodplains around Baraboo, or the jack pine grove where UWSP now stands. May her memory be an inspiration to all of us. Thank you.